Hello, and welcome to our event today. My name is Lisa Reisman, and I am the CEO of Azul Partners and the Executive Editor here at MetalMiner. We have a great event planned for you today, and I am thrilled to be doing my first unscripted fireside chat. I am joined by Trevor Stansbury, the founder and CEO of Supply Dynamics, and John Byrne, the former Vice President of Aircraft Materials and Structures at Boeing. We have quite a few questions planned for all of you, and we hope to cover everything outlined here on our agenda. But I want to invite you, the audience, to participate as much as you'd like and help direct the conversation. Simply enter in any questions you have into the Q&A widget within the audience console on your screen. And please also take note of the additional resources we have provided for you, which we can't see, but you can see. Before we begin, in case you aren't familiar with Azul Partners or MetalMiner, I wanted to provide a very brief intro to our brand. Azul Partners is the leading B2B publisher of procurement and supply chain intelligence. And now I'll just switch over to our site, MetalMiner, just a little bit of information on that. MetalMiner is one of our two main sites. We provide three primary services. The first, quite simply, is to publish metal price intelligence around metal prices. We offer most of that free of charge, as most of you know. And the second is our forecasting services to provide future trend analysis and actionable insight, helping buying organizations better understand current metal market price trends and how to make purchases based on those trends. Lastly, MetalMiner provides metal price benchmarking at the alloy, form, grade, and size level. Just show you a little visual of what that is. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic along to Trevor to provide a brief intro to Supply Dynamics, and then we'll get started. Trevor, thank you so much for being here today.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lisa. Let me tell you a little bit about Supply Dynamics. We license a non-invasive, web-based software as a service solution to some of the largest manufacturing companies in the world. Unlike other procurement technologies SDX is not a replacement for your ERP. It works in concert with whatever existing ERP or MRP or other engineering system that you have. And we give you visibility into all levels of the end-tier supply chain, from the OEM down to any mills and distributors that might be furnishing raw materials to your outside suppliers. We have customers in aerospace, appliance, automotive, heavy industry, and many other industries. Really, to articulate the crux of what it is that we do for our customers is we help eliminate the problem of data dislocation, the fact that information doesn't exist in one place, that it's fragmented across the extended enterprise. So if you look at most MRP and ERP solutions, they do a great job giving you visibility into high-level part and assembly demand. But what SDX does is we give you visibility into everything below the waterline in this diagram. So we call this the bill of resource. What are the metals, plastics, electronic components, standard catalog hardware, resins, you name it. And what this does is it allows an original equipment manufacturer to collaborate with all of its outside machined or fabricated part suppliers on the procurement of common materials. So again, the solution is going to give you product to elemental visibility, and I think you can see why Lisa invited us to contribute to this fireside chat. We've spent 16 years doing this. Today we forecast over $500 million worth of aggregate material requirements for our customers. Now, the use cases are diverse. You can use this for forecasting and expediting the timely purchase and supply of raw material. You can use it to collaborate with outside suppliers on the purchase of those materials, electronic components, plastics, metals, whatever it might be. Certainly, you can use it to standardize materials, to keep your bills of materials up to date and accurate over time, even in an environment that's changing constantly. And there's some other nice risk management features of the application that allow you to understand what your hedging opportunities are. Are you compliant with REACH or DFAR requirements? So again, I think the crux of what we do is help companies that have distributed manufacturing environments. We assist them in managing and seeing stuff that they haven't previously been able to see and control. I'll turn it back to you, Lisa.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Very helpful. So again, let me just kind of reiterate our little format here. I'm going to start with some questions and kind of go back and forth. We've already received a couple of questions from the audience. Keep piping those in. We'll try to address those as we go. So let me kick it off, John, and start with the first question to you. If you wouldn't mind, we kind of like to lay the foundation for this discussion by helping us why don't you tell us a little bit about what you had previously done at Boeing, and to share with us really kind of what started the evolution for companies in general. What were the trends and the things that were going on that allowed companies or caused companies to want to do more outside their four walls in the first place?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. I think maybe the best place to start is the reason why companies really wanted to do more outside their four walls was really the ability for people to focus on where they added the most value. And if they did not have a strong position, say, in a particular capability or manufacturing operation, then that was an opportunity to move that to another person in the supply chain that could, in fact, do that better and perhaps at a lower cost and better quality. I think that it's kind of dependent upon the situation at each industry, but I think all industries have kind of evolved to a more distributed supply chain, especially as they look and work some of the cost issues and risk issues. Our situation at Boeing, or I think any situation an OEM is going to face, it was initially born out of a situation that was driven by a crisis, which oftentimes is how people begin to look at these solutions. If you remember back into the late 90s, there was a lot of still cyclical nature in the aerospace industry, and that reverberated through the entire supply chain and hit the raw material suppliers pretty heavily. So you saw a lot of variability in lead times, in pricing, and things of that nature. And the most difficult place as an OEM to find yourself is when you're actually competing with key parts of your supply chain for precious capacity. And so when we looked at that, it didn't make sense for us to continue to do that. So we began a journey of trying to then aggregate and consolidate our metallic purchases. And the first and foremost piece of it was to bring some order to that part of our business such that our supply chain would be much more stable. If you can't get raw material, obviously it's very hard for the fabricators or the manufacturers to start on time. And if you don't start on time, you're probably never going to finish on time, and that's just not a good place to be in any industry. The second piece, obviously, that came into play very quickly was when you aggregate, obviously, you can increase your scale. And by increasing scale and focus, that does bring significant benefits from a cost standpoint with the suppliers. And if it's done right, both parties can benefit from that situation.
Thanks, John. It's interesting to hear that this was sort of born out of a crisis. I think the other impetus for a lot of companies to implement a whole bunch of programs is typically around some sort of compliance issue or some regulation that they have to adhere to. So not that crisis is very different, but anyway, it makes sense.
Well, those issues come into play. Those issues come into play, Lisa. I mean, and when the nice thing about it is if you have one of those programs in place and something like some of the regulatory or compliance issues come on, like conflict minerals or things of that nature, your ability to go look at that is extremely enhanced and makes the impact of those additional regulatory requirements to be much less than it could have been.
A great point, great point. So what are the most difficult challenges in managing programs with partners outside of the organization's four walls, or what have you found to be the biggest challenges? And maybe comment on expected versus unexpected, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I think, when you start any kind of major program or really any strategic change, you have to make assumptions about how people are going to respond or behave, things of that nature. I think it's really, the challenge is that when you make an assumption, if you don't really exercise why you made that assumption and what would happen if that assumption is wrong, I think that can create the biggest challenges. And I think one of the things that comes up is a lot of times, especially the larger OEMs, will make an assumption that their suppliers, because it's a supplier-customer relationship, will have the same motivations, the same priorities that the OEM has, and I don't think that's true. I think each person, depending where they're at in the supply chain and what part of the industry they're in, may have very different motivations, and it can be driven by just the commercial structure of the company. It can be driven by the supplier, the strategy. It can be driven by the culture, whether they reside in, the U.S. or other parts of the world. So I think one of the biggest challenges is understanding what everybody's needs are, and then finding a way to make sure that the OEM, obviously, in the case of a tie, is always going to take their position, but where you can find win-win solutions for people and educate them on that, I think that will be really good, because when you put one of these programs in place, you are acting as a bit of a disruptor, and that disruptor, if you don't have your eyes open and have good lines of communication, sometimes can create some unintended consequences that can be pretty disruptive or create more risk for you.
Great, and I know we're going to touch on some of those in a minute, but I'm just going to shift gears slightly and just broaden this, because I know that obviously, John, you come from the aerospace industry. Trevor, I know you've worked with many Fortune 500 organizations across multiple industries. Can you be maybe a little more specific and give us some of the challenges that you've seen companies struggle with outside of aerospace? And then would you say, it sounds like there's a lot of different reasons, different stakeholders have different reasons for participating, not participating, and or struggling to participate. Are these challenges the same across all industries, or is there any industry difference? And can you speak to some of those similarities or differences?
Yeah, so let's speak to the most obvious challenge, is that most of these companies used to make everything under one roof, and they've spent the last 20 years outsourcing the majority of the parts and assemblies that were once made in-house to outside suppliers. And they've had to do that really to address increasing customer demands as far as cost and service levels and increasing competition. So now you've got OEMs outsourcing the majority of what they once made in-house from hundreds of outside suppliers that are buying from, again, dozens, if not hundreds of outside distributors and manufacturers. So when you look at the material input that goes into that part, one of the things that people often forget is that 30 to 60% of the cost of a machined or fabricated part has nothing to do with that outside supplier's labor rate, overhead, or machine speeds and feeds. So 30 to 60% of the cost of that part are things like forgings, castings, bar stock, sheet metal, tubes, wires, standard catalog hardware, electronic components. And John, I think, very accurately described the challenge for a large company, which is, hey, if anything goes wrong in that extended value chain, the OEM ultimately pays the price in the terms of either a more costly product or parts that don't show up on time, and therefore products that don't get delivered to customers on time. So this is something that's common, whether you're in aerospace, heavy industry, automotive, and we have customers in all of those segments. Now, where you see a lot of diversity is in how you roll out a program and how you create rules of engagement that appeal to the subcontractors so that there's some real motivation to participate. And we don't have time to go into a lot of those details, but the rules of engagement make a difference. Now, I'll show you one other chart that's kind of interesting. One of the challenges for an original equipment manufacturer that wants to collaborate with all of its outside suppliers on the procurement of direct material is how do you deal with the fact that data is unstructured? In other words, not everybody calls out metals, plastics, or electronic components the same way. And so what happens is you get an OEM or a sub-tier supplier that spends an awful lot of time just cleansing data. So it's only been in the last 10 years or so that technology has evolved to the point that would actually enable companies like Boeing or others to systematically collaborate and orchestrate the purchase of common materials across that extended enterprise.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. So let's flip gears slightly and go back to you, John, and talk about how you sort of strategically address some of these challenges, and organizationally, how in the world did you do it? How do you do this in a really large organization, and how do you start prioritizing what your biggest pains were, if you will?
Yeah, so I think let's start with the organizational piece of it. I think one of the biggest challenges is typically these are run from the procurement organization. And in many cases, the skill set that's needed to really put this in place and effectively manage it goes beyond the standard skill sets of, say, procurement people. You really need to have some people that can think, about systems. You really need to have some very good analytical type folks, industrial engineering type people, because you're really looking at an entire system that you're trying to really fundamentally change the direction of. You have to have people that can really understand forecasting, bills and material, things of that nature. So I think you have to go through the organization and take a look at the skill sets and the types of people you have. And if you don't have the right skill sets, some cases people will be able to learn and move, but for the most case, you're going to have to augment and bring in the skills that are going to be needed to not only effectively put it in place, but also continue to execute. And then, quite frankly, once you put it in place, the opportunities and the way you want to manage the program is going to change as you become smarter and more capable with it in place. I think strategically, as you think about it, again, you have to think about what are going to be your rules of engagement. Trevor spoke a little bit about that, but you can. Again, I think one of the challenges, again, if people don't have the same motivation, sometimes you expect, well, I'll ask people to do this and they'll do it, but they may not actually do it. They may, on one hand, support you, and on the other hand, be doing things that are somewhat disruptive back to you, but it's in their best interest. So I think you have to find what I'll call the rules of engagement, make sure those are very clear and are flowed down. And in essence, you got a participation agreement that you have to be very clear about if you're going to work with us, whether whatever industry you're in, what's going to be the rule for the partners or the suppliers that are involved in it, about the quality of their forecast, the timeliness of their data inputs, the ability in terms of their ordering, lead times, things of that nature, change, the fact that they can't move in and out of the program. I think that's a decision you have to make. In the early parts of my experience, we allowed people to move in and out, and the industry, as you know, especially on the metal side, things are very different depending on what part of the cycle you're in. And so when you have an oversupply, clearly cost will come down and there'll be material available through multiple channels. The problem is, though, then when people go out to do that, then when things change, and they can change relatively fast, like they did in 05, 06, that when lead times press out and our cost really goes through the roof, then the people that are on the outside want to come back in, and you just can't have that in-out type of behavior going on. So you have to kind of think long-term about what are going to be the rules, and then make sure there is clear communication and some oversight with everybody that participates so that they know what's expected of them, what they have to do going forward.
Let me just follow up real quick on rules of engagement. Actually,
Sure.
I took some notes and was wondering, were you referring to getting sort of stakeholder buy-in internally? I mean, I knew as you were speaking that you were talking about the extended supply chain and the participants, and well, I have a follow-up question to that. But the rules of engagement, how did you get like even everybody internally to agree? Did you use that internally too?
Yeah, I think the challenge that sometimes, again, depending on the size of your company, obviously the bigger the company, sometimes it may be even more challenging to do the internal alignment than it is externally, right? Again, because people can look at a solution, say, in a 12-month time frame, and if you're doing your financial analysis and you're purely looking at cost, well, you could make one decision to go a certain direction, but that would not be in the best interest as you looked at it over the complete cycle, say a 10-year time frame. And so getting that alignment and getting that consistency of strategy locked in place internally is extremely important, because one of the things you don't want to do is be spending your bandwidth and energy working the internal stuff when the benefit is by really managing the external system and getting the supply chain to get cost out, to be more efficient and be more optimized.
You know, Lisa, I'll interject something else, and I think John just spoke to it, but there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to managing direct materials across the extended enterprise. As we look at the last 16 years of helping large manufacturers do this, we've seen companies that have taken more of a command and control approach, where it is a actual requirement, if you want to be a supplier, to procure material under what's called a directed buy program, where the OEM basically quarterbacks the negotiation of aggregate material requirements with one or a few sources of supply, and then directs its outside contract manufacturers to buy off of that contract. But we've also seen very successful programs where an OEM makes participation completely voluntary, and you basically are given the option to either opt in or opt out. And it's interesting to hear John talk about it, because he's lived this. It's just amazing. I would say holistically, if I were to generalize, about 80% of the contract manufacturers usually welcome a program like this with open arms. You know, typically when they go to buy material, they're not buying in sufficient quantities to command the kind of pricing that others are. Typically they don't get the kinds of service levels that the big guys do. And so about 80% of your suppliers will welcome it. There are always some suppliers that require some persuasion, mainly because they're suspicious of the intentions of the original equipment manufacturer. So John, I think, very smartly pointed out that if you're upfront with everybody about what the rules of engagement are, if you can get people to understand the big picture in terms of what the benefit is, you're much more likely to not face the kind of resistance that you would otherwise. And if you look at the typical ROI, I mean, there's lots of stuff. There are lots of reasons to collaborate, right? If you look at leveraging common material input demand for cost reduction, well, there's an opportunity there for everybody to save money. Yeah, if you look at data and maybe standardizing the sizes or quantities of materials per release that are purchased, well, there's another great opportunity, not just for the OEM and for its suppliers, but for the mills and distributors that are involved in that supply chain. Certainly tracking scrap and hedging and, compliance with regulatory requirements are all other reasons to do this. But I think you have to be very straight and understand up front, why are we doing this and what are the benefits for all parties? I mean, if you're a distributor and you get line of sight into what the demand for direct materials are, not just for the next 3 months, but the next 12 or 18 months, you're able to do things a lot more efficiently and be a lot more responsive to your customer than if you're operating in the dark and waiting for POs to materialize. So I would just corroborate with what John is saying. You need to understand, why are we doing this? What are the benefits to all the parties? And you need to communicate those to everybody up front.
Great. Let me field a question from the audience, if you don't mind. And John, back your way. An audience member asked if, did your company share savings with suppliers, or did you take all of the savings? And how did you ensure your company got the full benefit you were supposed to at the part level? Maybe that second part Trevor can answer, but John, maybe the first one, did you share savings with suppliers?
Well, I think you have to look at it like from the standpoint that whatever industry you're in, whether you're a supplier or you're the OEM, the end benefactor is the marketplace or the customer, right? The customer is going to, and the marketplace is going to require what level of market pricing or cost has to be produced by the OEM and its supply chain. The way I always had the conversation with people was what we can do is we can do some things that can allow you to be more focused on the places where you add value and that you can execute on. So since I already have a team that's buying raw material and doing a lot of other things, it doesn't make sense for you to have that same cost structure embedded. The second part of it is because I can take a look at it at a system level, at the OEM level, and extract pretty significant benefits, that takes the pressure off to some degree. Now people will debate this, but to some degree off the part pricing. And the flip side of that is I explain to people, look, if I can't do this from a system standpoint, then I'm just going to come back to each and every individual supplier and put even more pressure on them from a part pricing standpoint. So you can kind of take a look at it. Maybe it gets shared. It doesn't get directly shared, but there are substantial benefits for both sides, all the participants, if they understand how to make it work.
Great, thank you. I also want to go back. Trevor, you had indicated you would use the word directed by, I should say the words directed by. And I know that term is used in many different industries. I know from a metal buying perspective, we have a number of our readers across industries that are involved in programs like that. Could, John, maybe you take the first pass and maybe help us understand what a right-to-buy program is versus a directed buy, and do rebates fit in with any of these or anything? So just kind of throwing that out there. Either of you can answer it.
You want me to take a first crack at this, John?
Sure, go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, so it's very simple, Lisa. Directed buy is where the OEM basically directs its outside suppliers to buy from one or a few sources of supply. And typically, it's enforced through a supplemental purchase order condition that's on the purchase order for the parts or assemblies that they're buying. So, for example, the supplemental purchase order condition might say, all raw material used in the manufacture of this part number must be bought from our designated source of supply, X, Y, or Z. A right-to-buy contract tends to be a little bit more voluntary. And now the problem with a right-to-buy contract is if you're a distributor or a mill, there's a natural suspicion that an OEM will negotiate a right-to-buy contract to direct all of its suppliers to buy off of that contract. But if the OEM doesn't have a way to enforce that and to monitor and make sure it's happening, then typically the distributor or mill is not going to be very excited about extending a preferential price to that supply network because there is no enforcement mechanism. Now, if you do have a means through a shared platform, then you have a way of monitoring what people are actually doing and whether those volumes are materializing as expected. But again, the simple answer to your question is right to buy tends to be voluntary. Directed buy tends to be prescribed by the OEM or the network sponsor.
Got it. That's helpful. Can I just follow up with one quick follow-up question on that, and that is the payment issue on a directed buy. So how does that work? If you've got like all these multi-tier channel partners that are buying off the directed buy, are they actually issuing the purchase order for that material and it's going to them, or is it somehow go to the OEM, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's no one way to skin that cat either. But I will tell you that companies like Boeing and others are much more reluctant than they used to be to consign raw material to their outside suppliers. It ends up tying up a ton of cash. So if you can do it without consigning material and allow the outside contract manufacturer to buy directly from a mill or a distributor, that is the ideal way to do it. And the trend that I'm seeing is most companies getting out of the consignment business because they can get as much control as if they were vertically integrated using an appropriate technology solution to connect the dots between everybody and monitor what's going on. They can get as much control that way as they would if they consigned raw material. Now, John, I think in your case, most of the programs that you did, the network sponsor, the OEM, actually owned material. Is that right?
On the metallic side, that's true. On some of the other commodities that was done, we did not own the material or the inventory. So there's multiple ways to do that. And again, some of it just depends a little bit on the scale and complexity situation. And so I think the larger you get and the more complex you get, then the question becomes, where do you want to do that, and where's the value benefit? Does the OEM do it, or do they have the mill or the supplier of that commodity do that? I tend to kind of lean on letting because I came from an OEM biased perspective, but dealing with the size and complexity that I did, I wanted more control. But as Trevor said, there's multiple ways to attack it. Again, it's really how you want to run your business, and then how good you're going to be at the communication, the forecasting, and the if you will call it the execution on the rules of engagement.
That's helpful, and I hope I haven't hijacked the conversation, but I think it's really interesting, and it seems very relevant and topical right now, just discussing what a directed buy program is. So you talk about aggregation, directed buy, et cetera. Trevor, what other ways does technology support some of the challenges in managing that external supply chain? And I'm going to let you go a little technical wonky here for a couple of minutes, and maybe just define for us as well, what is structured versus unstructured data, and just maybe give us a definition of what you mean by that, and how that manifests in managing external suppliers and parts and all of that.
Yeah, I'm going to push a graphic that I think is helpful. If you look at the 5 stages of supply chain visibility or maturity, and this was put out, by the way, by Gartner, most companies are typically at stages 1 or 2. You'll see very few of them at 4 or 5. And one of the reasons why it's a little bit challenging to be able to get to, from reactive supply chain where you're maybe anticipating some things, but mostly you're reacting. One of the challenges of getting from that stage to where you're really integrating, collaborating, and orchestrating demand is the fact that data is fragmented across the extended enterprise. And when the OEM, what we call the network sponsor, asks the outside supplier to provide that information, even if the outside supplier were willing to provide it, and by the way, in some cases they're reluctant to do so, but even in those cases where they would report what their bill of material is or their bill of resource, none of them subscribe to the same taxonomy or nomenclature. So you might have somebody call material out by a specification. Somebody else has it in their ERP by form, alloy, and grade. Somebody calls something titanium 6-4, and somebody puts a dash between the 6 and the 4. Well, that may seem like a trivial problem, but it actually has significant ramifications when it comes to merging data, being able to understand what's common, so that you can assist companies in collaborating on procuring common materials. Again, we could be talking about tubes, pipes, electronic components, transistors, resistors, diodes, whatever. So I'm glad you brought it up because, and I think John will probably want to weigh in on this also. I would suggest to you that one of the biggest challenges in trying to do aggregation, as we're describing it, is getting material, getting information about material to conform to a common uniform taxonomy and nomenclature. So again, we call that unstructured data. How do you get good structured data that you can now leverage, not just for cost reduction, but there are lots of other benefits. You might want to standardize the way materials are being purchased. Instead of having 12 suppliers buying 32 different gauges of 321 stainless steel sheet metal, you might want to have them buy to a few standardized gauges. Now that's a benefit to the mill, and that's a benefit to the distributor, right? So I hope that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I hope that helps. John, I mean, would you agree that this problem of structured versus unstructured data is something that really is a challenge that needs to be addressed?
Absolutely. I think that in the absence of good data, good structured data, the opportunities that are presented in an aggregation strategy do get somewhat limited. If you have very good structured data and it's very disciplined, I think the slide that Trevor showed earlier in terms of the opportunities to remove costs from the total system are probably understated. I just think we don't appreciate, I think, as we look at this system, because it's evolved over so many years for lots of different reasons, how inefficient it is in whole. And it's obviously very different from industry to industry, but the aerospace industry, especially where I came from, where you're building airplanes, I mean, my God, we knew what our production rates were 2 years in advance. And, the bill of material should be fairly stable, or the change has a fairly rigid process to it. But so you should be able to drive some very good activity through the entire system, and that just hasn't been the case. And I think in many cases it's because the data just isn't structured. So you start to ask questions, well, why is this happening? And as you get more of the data structured, you start coming on some of the things that Trevor mentioned. I mean, you can find that you've sub-optimized your supply chain at the wrong place. That actually, took out some cost, but it actually added more complexity into the entire system, which in the end, the OEM ends up paying for. And so you've kind of embedded a structural complexity cost that you can't get at. So having that data structured starts to open up a lot of insight into what can happen and what should happen, such that the system should be much more efficient.
Lisa, you asked about what some of the less obvious benefits are. Well, there's the obvious benefit of being able to leverage common raw material demand for cost reduction. But I will tell you that most of the customers that we have worked with over the last 16 years or so, they're more interested in continuity of supply. They just want to make sure that the material shows up and is available on time when the supplier needs it, so that raw material is never the reason a part is late. And I can't underscore enough. In fact, I would defy you to point to a supply chain initiative that has the potential to be as transformational as material demand aggregation. I mean, you can spend the next 3 years trying to wring out 1 or 2% of cost by doing lean manufacturing, one-piece flow, Kanban, Kaizen, or you can start working with your outside suppliers to collaborate on the procurement of common materials, and suddenly you're going to impact inventory levels, you're going to impact cycle times for your products, you're going to impact your ability to be compliant to REACH and DFAR, and I think John mentioned conflict minerals regulations. You're just going to be able to do a lot of stuff that you were never able to do before. We've even had some situations or some customers tell us that, getting visibility into the material input piece of the total product cost equation has allowed them to start putting together should cost estimates. What should this assembly cost? If 30 to 60% of the cost of the part of the assembly is raw material, we'd better get a handle on that.
No, that's great.
Yeah,
it's compelling. Go ahead.
Oh, Lisa, I'm sorry. I'll take a little bit of counter to Trevor's point, but basically well aligned. I think the production system that in essence is going to produce whatever product the OEM or whomever's producing, that production system, as it leans out, as it gets more efficient, ends up placing the requirements onto whatever system or capability you have to deliver the raw material. So if you think about it, you can have a very lean, one-piece flow final assembly or production system, and it's going to then demand of the raw material system to basically provide material on demand, basically built to order. And if you don't have some kind of aggregation, if you don't have that structured data, there is no way you'll be able to support that. And in fact, you may actually constrain the production system from doing what it needs to do, because it will then have to adjust to the inefficiencies that you have in whatever delivery system you have for your raw material.
Great point, John. I concur completely.
Great. Well, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to shift gears on you both, just so that we kind of cover a number of different issues and whatnot. So, John, this is a question for you in terms of, I know we've touched on it in terms of getting external partners, quote unquote, on board with the notion of collaborating over a platform. Did you have to do extensive training? Tell us about some of what you needed to do to kind of roll this out and get folks on board and using it. It still seems like daunting, particularly when you're talking about sharing bills of material and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think you do have to have, again, a good training program, but the education process is going to occur at multiple levels, right? You have the using community that's going to be engaging with and basically using the system or the program. Obviously, they have to know the very detailed procedural process activities that are necessary to go on. You have to also, I think, build a case, and this is done through, I think, the relationships you have to have with more senior leaders of your supply chain, and that has to basically build the case as to why and so forth. So that they're not spending time trying to figure out how to go around it. They're trying to figure out their time on how to take more advantage of it and be more in alignment, things of that nature. So it's a constant deal, because you're going to continue to make improvements in your system at the execution level, at the process level. So you got to have a way to communicate and spread that quickly. And at the same time, as you learn on how to add additional capabilities that maybe strategically change things, then making sure that you have alignment throughout your supply chain at the leadership levels is really important too.
Did you have any strategic suppliers that balked or, were not really prepared to move forward, or basically were those fellows?
Well, I think yeah, you do. Again, look, I mean, an OEM typically has suppliers that have multiple OEMs as customers, and so the supplier has to figure out how to deal with, if you have multiple customers that have multiple approaches to this, then how do you optimize your business on behalf of your own stakeholders? I think that's a real challenge. And so when you face that, you have to decide how you're going to engage. And we had some situations where, it took different approaches on how to bring people on board. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, that's perfect. Let me go back a step, and then Trevor, I'll come back to you. So, John, what kinds of solutions did you consider using? And as you began with this quote-unquote crisis, right?
Right.
How did you think about how you were going to address this? What did you deem the most critical capabilities from your perspective that, that technology needed to offer to you? And how did you even just go about this journey? I mean, who did you pick up the phone and call, or how did that work?
Well, I think when we first got started, again, we've done it on, or I did it on several different types of commodities, and so over the last, almost 20 years, the commodities that we started in the late 90s, that was a different. We didn't have a good solution. We had to basically work with a partner to create a solution. There was distribution channels that were available, logistical channels that were available, but really aggregating and engaging and managing the data that basically ended up being somewhat homegrown. As we got later on in the processes, as we moved into 2010 or whatnot, then people like Supply Dynamics were available in the marketplace, and so you can take what you're, in essence, just basically run an additional procurement activity, or go out and engage the marketplace with a set of requirements and whatnot, and see what solutions will provide the best solution for whatever you're trying to get done. So we've done both. We've kind of organically grown it, and we've bolted on solutions that have come via external capabilities. And again, the larger the size and more complex you are, that's probably going to do it. I mean, I know that you get a big battle between, hey, look, here's our IT solution in our company, so we want to do it all under this umbrella, but yet that umbrella doesn't have really what's necessary to go do the types of things you want to do from the raw material program. So what do? Do you find a way to pull in an external capability and bolt it on, or do you try and integrate internally? Those are all questions everybody's going to face because everybody has a different situation that will confront them in their company situation.
Great. That's helpful.
I would add, Lisa, that most of the time what we see is that OEMs approach this with armies of people and the mother of all spreadsheets. And as John can attest, probably, that's, eventually that can result in some pretty catastrophic failure modes. But it is, aggregation is nothing new. People have been doing this for some time. It generally was done with the mother of all spreadsheets and lots of people.
No, that's helpful. And I have go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I said we've got an acronym for the mother of all spreadsheets, but I'm not going to say that here on this webinar, but you guys can all have a little giggle about that. Trevor, we've gotten a number of questions in from the audience. We're not going to be able to answer all of them, but a lot of them are around the value propositions. But I'm going to steer this question toward the value propositions I'm looking for the mom and pop job shop that's, a lower tier supplier. What's in it for them? And I think there is a perception that all of the supplier platforms basically benefit the OEM. And John, you've touched on it from a customer perspective of how it impacts the ecosystem, but I'm looking walk me through the value propositions for the little guys, they're way up in the chain and are, even just coming on a platform is traumatic and stressful for them.
Yeah, no problem. So the best platforms out there today, and certainly we offer one, but we're not the only game in town. The best platforms do not require that mom and pop shop or that small and medium sized fabricator to do a lot of work. And one of the failure modes relative to structured data is if in doing an aggregation program, you're relying on your subcontractors, your outside suppliers, to self-report all of that bill of material. That's a huge task. And so there are engineering services that are available where you can take an engineering drawing and document all of the part attributes so that you don't have to ask your outside suppliers to do that. We happen to call it part attribute characterization. But if you look at the main value for that small or medium-sized contract manufacturer, I haven't seen in 16 years very many examples where a price that was better than what that supplier was paying wasn't achieved through aggregation. Typically, if the rules of engagement are right, you would allow that contract manufacturer to benefit by buying cheaper or more competitively priced materials through the program. The second benefit is that the material will be there when they need it. And that's a big deal. When you're a small or medium-sized shop and business is good and raw material prices are escalating as they are doing, we all know that raw material prices are lifting off of what were historical lows, and when that starts to happen, it puts that medium to small machine shop at a real disadvantage to others. You know, they may have the best quality system, they may machine more efficiently than anyone else, but they lose business because a contract manufacturer twice their size that just happens to buy more raw material is buying it at a more competitive price than they are. So I think there's a true and very unusual win-win-win here. There's a win for the contract manufacturer. There's a win for the OEM. And I'll tell you, no one wins more than the Miller distributor that is selected by somebody like Boeing or John Deere or GE and becomes the recipient of that forecast. I think a lot of people think of aggregation and they think, well, it's all about leveraging volume for cost reduction. It's not. It's about leveraging information to help everybody make smarter, more efficient decisions. And that is especially true for the mills and distributors. Their biggest risk is that they produce something that no one buys, either the wrong spec of material or the wrong size of material. So it's a win-win. And going back to what John said earlier, I think it's important that you address these benefits and understand what you're really attempting to achieve through aggregation up front so that you can articulate those benefits to the stakeholders.
That's super helpful. John, let me just turn it to you and see if you had anything you wanted to add to that last question on just the value proposition for the lower tier suppliers.
I would completely agree with Trevor in terms of a small manufacturer where they have the advantage in terms of, I think, being beneficial to the OEM is they typically have a more nimble, smaller cost structure. They typically focus on the things they do best, and not having to worry about purchasing raw materials gives them the ability to really capitalize on that advantage that they have over, say, larger players in the supply chain. I think the second thing is that if, in fact, the OEM, that's what they've chosen to do, and it's a key part of their strategy, because, again, remember that the risk profile for the OEM is very different than it is for any of the sub-tier suppliers. Because if, say, material is not available, the potential revenue stream at the OEM that's at risk is very different than the revenue stream that's at risk at the supplier, the sub-tier, even though on a relative basis it's just as important for that supplier. But so you have to think about where the OEM is going to come from and how they want to manage risk. And so when people say, hey, look, I want to be a really good partner or a really good supplier of that OEM, then one of the best things the small sub-tiers can do is to really fully utilize and participate in those programs. That sends a great message to the OEM, and quite frankly, I think it will in turn result in more business if they do it right.
That's interesting, and I liked that perspective a lot in terms of them focusing on their core competencies and being recognized and able to win more business because of that. So, John, last question for you, although I do have one more after it. But if you could do it all over again and you were given the mandate to outsource and work with your extended supply chain, hindsight's 20/20, what would you do differently?
Oh, well, clearly I would have been much more aggressive on getting structured data in place. I think probably much more definitive participation rules, and then being much more aggressive on the information technology so that the information that's coming through can drive the next set of improvements. I also probably would have been, if I had the magic wand, I guess, probably a little bit more heavy-handed on driving everybody to participate to get to 100% participation, because that's critical. I think that really allows you to really be successful. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does make things easier. And then I think I probably would have even been more aggressive in bringing in different skill sets to help manage and execute the program.
Interesting. Trevor, your take on it might be a little bit different. So rather than, what have been your lessons learned in implementing this, what do you see across industry as what your clients have struggled with? What are some of their lessons learned? Are they similar to what John just mentioned? Are they different?
No, I think they're similar, Lisa. I would say that, a lesson learned that we have seen is that typically this type of initiative is very well understood by supply chain. Anybody in charge of buying machine parts and struggling with a continuous pressure to reduce cost and improve service levels, that they get it. They look at something like directed material and they know there's an opportunity. I think a lesson learned for us is that there are benefits that span other functions within an original equipment manufacturer, like engineering, quality, compliance, regulatory compliance. And so getting some of those folks exposed early and as stakeholders in a program can often give a program legs that it might not otherwise have. So, anecdotally, we had a situation not long ago where there was a sole source of supply that was driving everyone in the supply chain crazy, the OEM and all of its outside suppliers. Well, the quality and engineering guys got visibility into the aggregation program. They were invited to consult with supply chain on the problem. And what they did was they went to a mill that had never produced the material and said, look, we know there's no patent on this. We know you guys could produce it. Why are you not producing this material? And the mill said, well, it's simple. If we produce it, the incumbent source that's been making that material for the last 20 years just going to drop their price and we'll never get any business. And so what the OEM said was, well, if you'll produce it and you'll give us this price and be able to meet these quality requirements, we'll guarantee you 50% of the demand over the next 3 years. And within 12 months, there was a second source of supply. They were able to dramatically reduce the price of material. And now, instead of everybody being dependent on one source of supply, there were two in the marketplace. So I think a lesson learned is this is something that has the potential to impact more than just supply chain. It can address a plethora of other thorny problems relative to on-time delivery, the number of competitive sources that you have to work with, et cetera, et cetera.
Trevor, I love that. In fact, could have used your help for trying to open up supply markets for something we're working on. We have just about a minute left. I wanted to ask a quick question on, and this is really a left field question regarding GPOs or group purchasing organizations. I mean, is this aggregated way of buying, is this the new GPO, or are GPOs, do you see them evolving in terms of adding some of this collaborative supply chain, if you will, to their offerings? Do you guys even look at GPOs? Maybe Trevor, for you.
Yeah, I would say in a word, yes, this is the new GPO. And I think GPOs tend to take the same, outdated approach that many of the OEMs have tried, and GPOs will use armies of people and the mother of all spreadsheets to try to do this. The challenge with that, and something that didn't come up in this conversation, is that bills of materials age very quickly. If you don't have a way of keeping the bill of material up to date and accurate over time, you're dead. You'll have a flash in the pan. You might be able to drive a little benefit, but it'll be very short-lived. If you look at an OEM like Boeing or anyone else, they've got new part introductions. They're moving parts from one supplier to another, and they're redesigning existing part numbers. If in that environment, you really need a more sophisticated solution to keep that bill of material up to date and accurate over time. And I think that's what the GPOs have lacked. They've been able to get a snapshot in time of what the aggregate material requirements were, but they weren't able to keep that bill of material up to date and accurate over time. That's my 2 cents.
Great. No, I appreciate it. Well, we have crossed over our hour mark here, so this is the conclusion of our first fireside chat today. I want to thank you, the audience, for attending. I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Trevor and John, for the great discussion. And I also want to extend a huge thank you to Supply Dynamics for making today's event possible. We couldn't put on events like this without the gracious support of our sponsors, so thank you very much. And for the rest of you, goodbye and have a great day.